So, let's review. Israel entered into a covenant with Yahweh. However, Israel failed to uphold their side of the agreement. Therefore, Israel was placed under the curse. And part of the curse was that Israel would be scattered to all the nations on the earth, and also that their children would be given to another people. I recommend reading the 28th chapter of Deuteronomy in its entirety. Okay, now that we know Israel was scattered among the nations, let's look at the different ways in which Israel was scattered or dispersed. So the first dispersion was the Assyrian dispersion. This dispersion involved the scattering of the northern tribes. The next dispersion is the African dispersion. Details of this dispersion can be found within the scriptures to the right. The next dispersion is the Roman dispersion. Details of this dispersion were foretold by Christ in the 21st chapter of Luke. And finally, the last dispersion, arguably the worst dispersion of them all. Why? Well, because it lasted the longest and caused the most deaths, and it has the greatest impact on so-called African Americans today. The Inquisition dispersion. To understand why this dispersion impacts so-called African Americans most of all, we need to go back to the beginning of the transatlantic slave trade. In a book titled An Historical Survey of the Island of St. Domingo, it reads, "A curious circumstance was, however, omitted. When the Portuguese first began the traffic in Negroes, application was made to the Pope to sanctify the trade by a bull, which His Holiness issued accordingly. In consequence of this permission and authority, a very considerable slave market was established in Lisbon, which is Portugal, insomuch that above the year 1539, from 10 to 12,000 Negroes were sold there annually." You may wonder, why would a pope, the head of the Roman Catholic Church, authorize the Negro slave trade during the time of the Inquisition? Well, in order to answer that question, let's take a look at a few references, a few first-hand accounts. The following quote comes from a book authored by John Ogilby of London, who in 1674 was appointed His Majesty's cosmographer and geographic printer. Now, the following quote comes from page 574, and the name of the book is on your screen. And the quote reads, "That John III, King of Portugal, sent a colony thither above 200 years before, whom though the unwholesome air destroyed, yet the place was not left desolate. For he sent new inhabitants who first settled Guinea, next Angola, and lastly on the island of St. Thomas, that so they might be better used to the air, that the said king sold all those Jews for slaves that refused to embrace the Roman religion, and caused their children to be baptized, from whom coming thither in great numbers most of the present inhabitants were descended." In other words, the present inhabitants of Guinea, Angola, and St. Thomas were descended from the Jews. Keep in mind that Guinea, Angola, and St. Thomas are on the west coast of Africa, and that the King of Portugal placed the Jews on the west coast of Africa in great numbers because they refused to embrace the Roman religion. Now you understand why the Pope authorized the Negro slave trade. Here's the quote in its entirety. Please press your pause button now to read it for yourself. In 1622, Cape Verdean Governor Don Francisco confirms the presence of Jews on the Guinea coast. when he reports to the King of Portugal when he states, the Guinea coastal rivers were full of Jews who were masters of the local regions and were quite independent of the crown. The following is a 1743 map of Guinea. Notice that Guinea is located or shown on the map in yellow, and that to the south of Guinea is Angola. Notice that both of these territories make up the west coast of Africa. And also note that the Jews of the west coast of Africa were known to the Europeans as black Jews. Now on to our next quote. Now this next quote sheds additional light on the exportation of Jews to the west coast of Africa. And it reads, unfortunately, at the time of the expulsion, the plague was raging in Castile, and the fugitives brought with them the disease, propagating it wherever they went, and not unnaturally causing their advent to be viewed with loathing and horror. This circumstance induced King John to hasten their departure from Portugal, for which purpose ships were duly provided, according to the agreement, but such was the temper of the captains and the sailors that they subjected the Jews to the hardest possible conditions. They plundered them of their goods and valuables, even to their very clothes, and landed them naked and bare of everything on barren points of the African coast, leaving them to die of starvation or to be sold into slavery to the Moors. Nor was this all. The king wrested from their parents all the children between the ages of 3 and 10 of those Jewish immigrants who from poverty or otherwise had omitted to pay the capitation tax on entering, or who were forced to remain in Portugal, and had them transported to the newly discovered islands of St. Thomas, which then swarmed with alligators and other beasts of prey, to be brought up as Christians. This next quote comes from the official chronicler of King John, Garcia de Resende, and it reads, the official chronicler of King John, Garcia de Resende, reports on one of the methods to populate this island that also throws some light on the tragic form of Jewish participation in the Portuguese Atlantic Empire. The king had allowed Jewish refugees from Spain, from where they had been expelled in 1492, to remain in Portugal only in return for payment of an enormous ransom. In 1493, those who could not pay had their children taken away from them, baptized by force, and deported to St. Thomas in order to be raised as Christians and to help populate the island that the king had just leased to Alivero. Skipping ahead. Nothing is known of their further fate, although later chroniclers attribute the thriving sugar production on the island to the talents of these deported children and their offspring. So far, we've learned that the King of Portugal sent the Jews to the west coast of Africa. We also learned that the children of the Jews were sent to the west coast of Africa under the authority of the Roman Catholic Church, under the authority of the Pope, with the intent that they would be raised as Christians and sold into slavery. These West African Portuguese communities were described as black Portuguese communities in Guinea and in the islands. So far, we focused mainly on Portugal's involvement in the slave trade. However, now let's turn our attention to Spain. Now, the following quote focuses on the west coast of Africa. Now, feel free to press the pause button to read this quote in its entirety. However, I'm going to jump down to the bottom, and it reads as this. Moreover, in Spain, they but seldom put their malefactors, their criminals, to death, as we do in France. They send them all to these desert countries to traffic there, referring to the west coast of Africa. In other words, Spain sent their criminals, or their Jews, that were convicted by the Inquisition to the west coast of Africa to be sold there as slaves. Now, let's take a closer look at the Inquisition. Libro Negro. That was one of the popular names of the Book of the Inquisition. Within this book contained the punishments for every supposed crime, as well as the methods for conducting the punishments. Now, let's take a look inside of the Libro Negro to see exactly where those who were convicted were sent. It reads, "She shall be exiled to the island of Principe, St. Thomas, or Angola." Number 3, shall be exiled to Angola or St. Thomas. Number 4, exiled to St. Thomas or Angola. Number 6, shall be exiled to St. Thomas, Angola, or Brazil. Those sent into exile were later sold into slavery, and the profit made from them was immense. For example, the following quote reads, "By Angola accounts, that the profit of the Negro trade amounted yearly to 66 tons of gold." Here we note an interesting connection between the term Negro and the Inquisition. For example, Libro Negro, that was the term used for the Book of the Inquisition. Negro legend, that was the term used for the denial of Inquisition persecutions. And lastly, peste negra, or Black Death. That was the term used to describe the plague associated with the Jews. Now, you may wonder, what is the significance about the term Negro and the Jews? Well, to find out, let's take a closer look. The term Negro, or the Spanish word for black, wasn't commonly used in England until the 19th century. Now, what that means is that prior to being called Negro, Negroes were called something else. In fact, the term Negro, or the term black, was associated with the Jews. The Jews are composed of 3 or 4 separate racial elements. The Asiatic Negroid strain shows itself occasionally in the curly hair, the long eye, and proportions of the skull. The Jewish hybrids with the Negro in Jamaica and Ghana reproduce most strikingly the Assyrian type.